When Zora Carter offered to work for ruthless businessman Nathaniel Sinclair to save her family farm, she had no idea their deal would unravel years of secrets, betrayal, and an undeniable connection. But as love begins to grow, danger and truth threaten everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun shone through the tall windows of Sinclair Manor as Nathaniel Sinclair reviewed his business accounts. At 39, he was one of the richest men in town, known for collecting debts that others couldn't pay. His office was filled with expensive things he'd taken from people who couldn't keep up with their payments. "Mr. Sinclair, Henry Carter is here to see you," his secretary announced through the intercom. Nathaniel smiled coldly. The Carters had been avoiding him for months. Their small family farm was worth a lot of money, and he'd been waiting for the right moment to take it. "Send him in," Nathaniel said, straightening his designer tie. Henry Carter walked in looking tired and worried. His clothes were worn, and his hands showed years of hard work on the farm. Behind him came a young woman Nathaniel had never seen before. "Mr. Sinclair, please," Henry started, his voice shaking. "I need more time to pay the debt. The farm's been in our family for generations." Nathaniel leaned back in his leather chair. "Mr. Carter, you've had plenty of time. Unless you have collateral worth the debt, I'll be taking possession of the farm next week." That's when the young woman stepped forward. She was beautiful, with dark skin and fierce eyes that met his without fear. "I'm Zora Carter," she said, "and I have a proposition for you." Henry tried to stop her. "Zora, no! Daddy, let me handle this." Zora turned back to Nathaniel. "I'll work for you to pay off my father's debt. I have a college degree in business administration. I can be your personal assistant." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He looked at her carefully. She was young, maybe 23, and carried herself with dignity despite the situation. "And why would I agree to that?" "Because you know the farm isn't worth as much as having someone with my skills working for you," Zora said firmly. "And because I won't stop until the debt is paid." Nathaniel stood up and walked around his desk, enjoying the power he held over this family. "Your daughter is offering herself as collateral, Mr. Carter. How desperate." "You must be." "I'm not offering myself as property," Zora interrupted, her voice sharp. "I'm offering my work, my skills, and my time. There's a difference, Mr. Sinclair." Something in her tone made Nathaniel pause. Most people begged or cried when they came to his office. This woman was different. She was proud, strong, and unafraid. "Very well," he said finally. "1 year of work as my personal assistant. If you leave before the debt is paid, I take the farm. Do we have a deal?" "We do," Zora said, even as her father protested. "But I have conditions. I keep my own apartment in town. I work normal business hours unless there's a special event. And you treat me with respect." Nathaniel almost laughed. No one had ever dared to give him conditions before. "Fine, you start tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp." After they left, Nathaniel stood at his window, watching Zora and her father walk to their old truck. He'd taken many things from many people over the years, but this was different. This woman wasn't broken or afraid. She was a fighter. That night in his empty mansion, Nathaniel thought about Zora Carter. He told himself he'd accepted her offer because it was good business. But deep down, he knew there was something else. Something in those fierce eyes that made him want to know more. Meanwhile, Zora sat at her family's kitchen table, surrounded by her younger siblings. "It'll be okay," she told them, hugging each one. "I'll work for Mr. Sinclair, we'll keep the farm, and nothing will change." But as she lay in bed that night, Zora knew everything was about to change. She'd stood up to one of the most powerful men in town, and tomorrow she would start working for him. She wasn't afraid of hard work, but she was worried about something else. The way Nathaniel Sinclair had looked at her, like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. "I won't let him break me," Zora whispered to herself. "I'm not one of his possessions. I'm here to save my family, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." The next morning, as the sun rose over the Carter family farm, Zora got ready for her first day working for Nathaniel Sinclair. She chose her clothes carefully, professional but simple. She wouldn't let him think he could buy her with fancy things. As she drove to Sinclair Manor, Zora thought about all the stories she'd heard about Nathaniel Sinclair. People said he was cold, ruthless, and cared only about money, but she'd seen something else in his eyes yesterday. A flicker of surprise when she'd stood up to him. Maybe there was more to him than everyone thought. But that wasn't her problem, she reminded herself. She was here to do a job, save her family's farm, and keep her dignity intact. Nothing more, nothing less. Little did she know that her arrival at Sinclair Manor would start a chain of events that would change not just her life, but Nathaniel's too. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, like a proud young woman walking into a rich man's office, refusing to be broken. Zora's first week at Sinclair Manor was harder than she expected. Nathaniel seemed determined to break her spirit with impossible demands and constant criticism. Every morning, he'd have a new list of tasks waiting on her desk, each one more challenging than the last. "These reports are a mess," he said on Monday, throwing a stack of papers onto her desk. "Do them again." Zora took a deep breath and kept her voice steady. "The reports are fine, Mr. Sinclair. I double-checked every number." "Are you arguing with me?" He stood over her desk, using his height to intimidate her. "No," Zora replied calmly. "I'm telling you facts. If you check page 3, you'll see that the numbers match exactly what your accountant provided." Nathaniel grabbed the report and flipped to page 3. His face showed surprise for just a second before he covered it with a frown. "Fine. But I want the font bigger." Zora waited until he walked away before allowing herself a small smile. One small victory. The next few days followed the same pattern. Nathaniel would find fault with everything she did, but Zora refused to let him see her sweat. She arrived early each morning, did her work perfectly, and kept her head high. What surprised her most was how lonely the huge mansion felt. Besides the staff, who kept to themselves, Nathaniel seemed to have no friends or family visiting. He spent most evenings alone in his office, working late into the night. One evening, as Zora was preparing to leave, she heard voices coming from Nathaniel's office. The door was slightly open, and she couldn't help overhearing. "You're getting soft, Nathaniel," a man was saying. "The old you would have taken that farm months ago." "I'm getting my money's worth, James," Nathaniel replied. "The daughter is a better asset than the farm." Zora felt her face get hot with anger. An asset. That's all she was to him. The next morning, she walked into his office without knocking. "Mr. Sinclair, we need to talk." Nathaniel looked up from his computer, annoyed. "I'm busy." "I heard you last night," Zora said. "Calling me an asset. Let me make something clear. I'm here to work, not to be one of your possessions. If you can't understand that, maybe we should end this arrangement now." For a moment, Nathaniel just stared at her. No one ever confronted him like this. "You're awful confident for someone whose family could lose everything." "And you're awful lonely for someone so rich," Zora shot back. The words hung in the air between them. Nathaniel's face changed, showing real emotion for the first time. But whether it was anger or something else, Zora couldn't tell. "Get out," he said quietly. Zora turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "You know what your problem is, Mr. Sinclair. You think having power over people makes you strong. But real strength is being able to stand tall, even when you have nothing." She left him sitting there, staring after her. That night, Zora drove home to check on her family. Her younger siblings ran out to meet her, and the smell of her father's cooking filled the kitchen. This was what real wealth looked like, she thought. Love. Family. Togetherness. "How is it working for him?" her father asked quietly after dinner. Zora paused, thinking about Nathaniel's lonely evenings in his big office. "He's not as tough as he thinks he is." Back at his mansion, Nathaniel stood at his window watching. The sun set. Zora's words kept playing in his mind. Lonely. Was he lonely? He had everything he wanted: money, power, respect. But when he looked around his empty house, he couldn't ignore the silence. The next morning, something changed. When Zora arrived at work, she found a cup of coffee on her desk, made exactly the way she liked it. She looked up to see Nathaniel watching her from his office door. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," he said formally, but his voice was different, softer. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, hiding her surprise. Neither of them mentioned the coffee, but something had shifted between them. It was small, just a tiny crack in Nathaniel's cold exterior, but it was there. As Zora worked through her morning tasks, she caught Nathaniel watching her several times. Each time, he quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on something else. It would have been funny if it wasn't so strange, the powerful Nathaniel Sinclair acting like a schoolboy caught staring. That afternoon, when Zora brought him some contracts to sign, their fingers brushed slightly as she handed him the papers. A small touch, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock through both of them. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Thank you, Miss Carter." "You're welcome, Mr. Sinclair." As she walked back to her desk, Zora tried to ignore the way her heart was beating faster. This was business, she reminded herself. Just business. But deep down, she knew something was changing, and it scared her more than all of Nathaniel's attempts to intimidate her, because falling for Nathaniel Sinclair would be the most dangerous thing she could do. A month had passed since Zora started working at Sinclair Manor. The coffee on her desk every morning had become a routine, and Nathaniel's harsh criticism had softened into actual constructive feedback. But Zora kept reminding herself not to get too comfortable. After all, she was still here because of a debt. Everything changed the night of the Thompson Charity Gala. Nathaniel needed someone to accompany him, and his usual date had cancelled at the last minute. "Miss Carter," he called from his office, "I need you to attend the gala with me tonight." Zora looked up from her computer. "That's not part of our agreement, Mr. Sinclair." "I'll count it as overtime," he said, trying to sound businesslike. "The Thompson family are important clients. I can't show up alone." "I don't have anything to wear to a fancy party," Zora said. Nathaniel reached into his desk and pulled out a credit card. "Take the afternoon off. Buy whatever you need. Consider it a business expense." Zora wanted to refuse, but she saw something in his eyes, almost like he was pleading. Fine, but just this once. She spent the afternoon at an expensive boutique, feeling out of place among all the designer clothes. Finally, she found a simple but elegant blue dress that fit her perfectly. When she arrived at the gala that evening, Nathaniel was waiting outside. He stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time Zora saw him speechless. "You look appropriate," he managed to say. "You don't clean up so bad yourself, Mr. Sinclair," Zora replied with a small smile. Inside, everyone was watching them. Zora could hear the whispers. Who was this young woman with Nathaniel Sinclair? Why was he smiling at her like that? "Don't let them bother you," Nathaniel said quietly, placing his hand on her back as he guided her through the crowd. "Most of these people owe me money anyway." Zora laughed despite herself. "Was that a joke, Mr. Sinclair? I didn't know you had it in you." The evening went better than either of them expected. Zora charmed Nathaniel's business associates with her intelligence and wit. She noticed him watching her with something that looked almost like pride. Then James Morgan, the man from Nathaniel's office, approached them. "Nathaniel, enjoying your new asset?" Zora felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, but before he could speak, she stepped forward. "Mr. Morgan, I believe the word you're looking for is colleague. But I understand big words can be difficult for some people." James's face turned red. He looked at Nathaniel, expecting him to put Zora in her place. Instead, Nathaniel laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made everyone nearby turn and stare. "I think it's time for a dance," Nathaniel said, taking Zora's hand and leading her to the dance floor. As they danced, Zora could feel her heart racing. Nathaniel was a good dancer, and he held her closer than was strictly necessary for a business arrangement. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For being here. For standing up to James. For..." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "For making me laugh. I can't remember the last time I did that." Zora looked up at him, seeing vulnerability in his eyes. "Maybe you just needed someone to remind you how." They danced in silence after that, both aware that something was changing between them, but neither ready to acknowledge it. Later that night, as Nathaniel drove her home, Zora noticed they were taking the long way through the countryside. "Are you lost, Mr. Sinclair?" "No," he said quietly. I'm not ready for the evening to end." They stopped at a scenic overlook. The city lights sparkled below them and a full moon hung in the sky. "Why did you really hire me?" Zora asked suddenly. "You could have taken the farm. It would have been easier." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "Because you weren't afraid of me," he finally said. "Everyone else, they either fear me or want something from me, but you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't as powerful as I thought I was. And that made you want to hire me?" "It made me want to know you," he admitted. "Even if I didn't realize it at the time." Zora felt her breath catch. This was dangerous territory. "Mr. Sinclair—" "Nathaniel," he said. "Please, when we're alone, call me Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," she said softly, testing out his name. "This is complicated." "I know." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "But for the first time in my life, I don't care about complicated. I care about—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his hand found hers in the darkness of the car. They sat there for a long time, holding hands and watching the city lights, neither speaking. Both knew that tomorrow would bring questions and complications. But, for now in this moment, they allowed themselves to just be. When Nathaniel finally drove Zora home, he walked her to her door. "Thank you for tonight," he said formally, back to being Mr. Sinclair. But as he turned to leave, Zora caught his arm. "Nathaniel?" He turned back, and before either of them could think too much about it, she kissed him softly on the cheek. "Thank you for the dance," she whispered, then disappeared inside. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, touching his cheek where she had kissed him. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd forgotten how to feel: hope. The morning after the gala, everything felt different at Sinclair Manor. The usual morning coffee was waiting on Zora's desk, but this time there was also a single red rose beside it. Zora picked it up, trying to ignore the flutter in her heart. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," Nathaniel said, walking past her desk. But his eyes told a different story. They were warm, almost tender. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she replied professionally, though she couldn't help but smile. But their moment of happiness wasn't going to last long. James Morgan was waiting in Nathaniel's office, and he didn't look happy. "What do you think you're doing?" James demanded, as soon as Nathaniel walked in. "Everyone at the gala was talking about how you looked at that girl. Have you forgotten who she is? Why she's here?" "Be careful, James," Nathaniel warned, his voice cold. "What happens between me and Miss Carter is none of your business." Outside the office, Zora could hear every word. Her hands shook as she tried to focus on her. "Work, it is my business," James shot back. "I'm your lawyer, and I'm telling you this is dangerous. That girl is here because her family owes you money. If people find out you're involved with her, they'll say you're taking advantage. You could lose everything." Zora felt sick to her stomach. James was right. No matter how she felt about Nathaniel, their situation was all wrong. "I want you to leave," Nathaniel said firmly. "Now." But James wasn't finished. "Fine, but first, look at these photos." Zora heard papers being slapped onto a desk. Then silence. "Where did you get these?" Nathaniel's voice was dangerous now. "I had someone follow her," James said. "That's her meeting with Robert Chen yesterday, your biggest competitor. Still trust her?" Zora's heart stopped. Yes, she had met with Robert Chen. But not for the reason they thought. She'd been asking him about job opportunities for her younger brother, who was graduating high school soon. She hadn't told Nathaniel because it hadn't seemed important. Now it looked like she was betraying him. The office door flew open. Nathaniel stood there, his face dark with anger. "Ms. Carter, my office now." Zora walked in with her head held high, even though her heart was racing. On Nathaniel's desk were photos of her talking with Robert Chen outside his office building. "Explain," Nathaniel demanded. "I was asking about internship opportunities for my brother Tommy," Zora said calmly. "He graduates in June. I wanted to help him find a good job." "And you didn't think to ask me?" Nathaniel's voice was hurt beneath the anger. "I didn't want to mix business with personal matters," Zora said. "I guess I was wrong about that last night." James smirked from the corner. "See, Nathaniel, she's playing you." "I would never play him," Zora snapped, turning to face James. "Unlike I actually care about Nathaniel as a person, not just his money and power." The room went quiet. It was the first time she'd admitted out loud that she cared about Nathaniel. "James, get out," Nathaniel said quietly. "And if you ever have someone follow Miss Carter again, you'll be looking for a new job." After James left, Nathaniel sank into his chair, looking tired. "Why didn't you tell me about meeting Chen?" "Because I'm still trying to figure out what this is between us," Zora admitted. "Last night was wonderful, but this morning I remembered I'm here because my family owes you money. How can anything real grow from that?" Nathaniel stood up and walked around his desk. "The debt doesn't matter anymore. I'll tear up the contract right now if that's what you want." "No," Zora said firmly. "I won't let you do that. I made a deal, and I'll honor it. But maybe we need to keep things professional until the debt is paid. Is that what you want?" Nathaniel asked softly. "No," Zora whispered, "but it's what we need." They stood looking at each other, both wanting to close the distance between them, but knowing they couldn't. Finally, Nathaniel nodded. "Very well, Miss Carter, back to work then." But as Zora turned to leave, he called after her. "For what it's worth, I care about you too, more than I should." The rest of the day was torture. They tried to act normal, but every accidental touch, every shared glance felt electric. The coffee cup on Zora's desk seemed to mock them both, a symbol of something that could have been but couldn't be. Not yet. That evening, after everyone had left, Zora found a note on her desk. In Nathaniel's handwriting, it said simply, "I'll wait." She held the note to her heart, fighting back tears. In just 2 words, he had said everything she needed to hear. He would wait until the debt was paid, until they could start fresh with no complications. But neither of them knew that James Morgan wasn't done causing trouble. As he left the manor that evening, he made a phone call. "Mr. Chen, we need to talk about Zora Carter. I think she could be very useful to us." The sun set over Sinclair Manor, casting long shadows through the windows. Inside, 2 people worked, in separate rooms, trying to ignore their feelings for each other, unaware that their biggest challenges were still to come. 2 weeks had passed since Nathaniel and Zora decided to keep things professional. The morning coffee still appeared on Zora's desk, but there was no more Rose, no more lingering glances. They both threw themselves into their work, trying to ignore the tension between them, but James Morgan was busy putting his plan into action. He sat in Robert Chen's expensive office, spreading photos across the desk. "Look at these," James said, pointing to pictures of Nathaniel and Zora at the gala. "Sinclair's got a weakness now and we can use it." Chen studied the photos. "The girl works for him to pay off her family's debt? That's practically slavery. The press would love that story." "Exactly." James smiled. "And once Sinclair's reputation is ruined, his clients will come running to you. All we need is for the girl to help us." "Why would she help us?" "Because," James said, pulling out more papers, "I found something interesting about the Carter family debt, something Sinclair doesn't even know." Meanwhile, at Sinclair Manor, Zora was organizing files when she found something strange. Old documents about her family's loan. As she read them, her hands started shaking. "Mr. Sinclair," she called out, walking into his office, "I need to show you something." Nathaniel looked up, trying not to notice how beautiful she looked today. "What is it?" "These loan papers," Zora said, putting them on his desk. The interest rate changed halfway through. It nearly doubled. "Is that legal?" Nathaniel frowned and looked at the documents. "No, it's not. But I didn't handle this alone originally." His face darkened. "It was James. He managed all the paperwork. So my family's debt, it's not as much as we thought." "I need to look into this," Nathaniel said, standing up. "Something's not right." Just then, Nathaniel's secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Sinclair, there's a reporter from the Daily Times here to see you. She says it's urgent." Nathaniel and Zora shared a worried look. Before they could respond, a sharp-dressed woman walked in, holding a notebook. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm Sarah Martinez. Care to comment on allegations that you're forcing a young woman to work for you to pay off her family's illegal loan?" Zora felt the blood drain from her face. Nathaniel stepped in front of her protectively. "Get out," he growled at the reporter. "No comment," but Sarah Martinez wasn't done. Sources say you've been taking advantage of Ms. Carter, that you're using her family's debt to control her. The public would be very interested in this story. That's not true, Zora stepped forward. Mr. Sinclair has been nothing but professional, the reporter smiled. The photos from the charity gala suggest otherwise. After security escorted the reporter out, Nathaniel slumped in his chair. James, he said quietly, he's behind this. What are we going to do? Zora asked. Before Nathaniel could answer, his phone rang. It was Robert Chen. Sinclair, Chen's smooth voice came through the speaker. I think we need to talk. Come to my office tomorrow, alone, or the story about you and Ms. Carter goes public. After hanging up, Nathaniel looked at Zora with pain in his eyes. I won't let them hurt you. Whatever they want, I'll handle it. No, Zora said firmly. We handle it together. I'm not letting you face this alone. Their eyes met, and for a moment, all their professional pretense fell away. Nathaniel stood and walked to her, taking her hands in his. Zora, he said softly, using her first name for the first time in weeks. I can't let them destroy your reputation, your family's reputation. They won't, she said, because we're going to fight back. I found these papers for a reason. James has been cheating people for years, hasn't he? Nathaniel nodded slowly. Probably, but proving it. Then let's prove it, together. They spent the rest of the day going through old files looking for evidence of James's schemes. As they worked side by side, their shoulders touching occasionally, both felt the walls between them crumbling. Late that night, as they sat surrounded by papers, Zora found something. Look at this. James has been changing interest rates on all. The loans he handled, he's been stealing from you and your clients for years. Nathaniel studied the documents. This is it. This is what we need. He looked at Zora with admiration. You're amazing, you know that. She blushed but held his gaze. We make a good team. Yes, he said softly, we do. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by Nathaniel's phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number, with a photo attached. The photo showed Zora leaving Robert Chen's office building from yesterday, but Zora hadn't been anywhere. Near Chen's office yesterday. They're faking photos now, Nathaniel said, his voice hard. They're trying to make me doubt you. And do you? Zora asked quietly. Doubt me. Nathaniel reached out and touched her cheek gently. Never again. As they sat there, surrounded by evidence of James's crimes, they knew tomorrow would bring a confrontation. But something else had changed too. They weren't just fighting for justice now. They were fighting for each other. What they didn't know was that James Morgan was making one final move. In his office, he looked at the real photo he'd taken today, of Henry Carter, Zora's father, accepting an envelope full of cash from Robert Chen. Sorry, Zora, James smiled coldly. But everyone has a price, even your father. The next morning, Nathaniel and Zora arrived early at Sinclair Manor to prepare for their meeting with Chen. They had all the evidence of James's fraud spread out on Nathaniel's desk. Are you sure you want to come with me? Nathaniel asked Zora. Chen can be dangerous when cornered. We're in this together, Zora replied firmly. But before she could say more, her phone rang. It was her sister Amy crying. Zora, you need to come home right now, Amy sobbed. It's Dad. He's acting strange. He just came home with a lot of money, and he won't say where it came from. Zora felt her heart stop. She looked at Nathaniel, who had heard everything through the speakerphone. Go, he said softly. Family comes first. I'll handle Chen. But Zora shook her head. No. First Chen, then my father. We need to know what we're dealing with. They drove to Chen's office building in tense silence. In the elevator, Nathaniel reached for Zora's hand and squeezed it gently. Whatever happens, he said, remember that I trust you. Chen's office was on the top floor, with huge windows overlooking the city. He sat behind his desk with James Morgan standing beside him, both men smiling like they'd already won. Ah, Sinclair, Chen said smoothly. I said to come alone. Ms. Carter is my partner in this, Nathaniel replied coldly. She stays. Chen shrugged and pulled out an envelope. Fine, she should see this anyway. He slid the envelope across the desk. Inside were photos of Henry Carter accepting money from Chen, taken just yesterday. Daddy. No, Zora whispered, her legs feeling weak. Nathaniel put his arm around her, holding her steady. Your father was quite reasonable, James said with a cruel smile. All it took was enough money to pay off his debt. He agreed to testify that you forced his daughter to work for you, Sinclair, that you've been taking advantage of her. You're lying, Zora said, but her voice shook. Call him, Chen suggested. Ask him yourself. With trembling hands, Zora dialed her father's number. When he answered, she could tell he'd been drinking. Daddy? Is it true? Did you take money from Robert? Chen? There was a long pause. I did it for you, baby girl, Henry slurred. To free you from that man. Zora felt like she couldn't breathe. Nathaniel took the phone from her gently. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, you don't know what you've done. But before anyone could say more, Zora straightened up. Fire burned in her eyes. You want a story? She said to Chen and James. How about this one? She pulled out the files they'd found, slamming them on the desk. James has been changing loan interest rates illegally for years. He's been stealing from everyone, including you, Mr. Chen. Chen's smile disappeared as he looked at the documents. What is this, James? She's lying, James said quickly, but his face had gone pale. Look at the papers, Nathaniel said. Your company's loans are in there too. James has been playing both sides, stealing from everyone. Chen studied the documents, his face getting darker with each page. James, explain this. Now. But James was already backing toward the door. You can't prove anything. Actually, Zora said, pulling out her phone, we can. I recorded everything you said to my father yesterday, about bribing him to lie, about the fake photos, everything. James lunged for her phone, but Nathaniel stepped between them. In one smooth motion, he grabbed James by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Touch her, Nathaniel growled, and it will be the last thing you ever do. Security guards burst into the office, called by Chen's secretary when she heard the commotion. Chen pointed at James. Take him to my private office, Chen ordered. Mr. Sinclair and I need to have a talk about our mutual problem. After James was gone, Chen turned to Nathaniel and Zora. It seems I owe you both an apology. James has been stealing from me for years, and I never knew. Perhaps we can make a deal. First, Nathaniel said, you're going to tear up whatever agreement you made with Henry Carter. Done, Chen nodded. And the press? We'll hear nothing about this, Nathaniel finished. In exchange for your silence about James's crimes, Chen smiled. Always the businessman, Sinclair. Fine, we have a deal. As they left Chen's office, Zora was quiet. Nathaniel drove straight to the Carter farm, knowing she needed to confront her father. They found Henry sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope of money in front of him, his head in his hands. Daddy, Zora said softly. Henry looked up, his eyes full of tears. I'm so sorry, baby girl. I thought I was helping. They said Sinclair was taking advantage of you, that you were too proud to admit it. Mr. Carter, Nathaniel stepped forward. I know we didn't start on the best terms, but I care about your daughter. I would never hurt her. Henry looked at how Nathaniel stood protectively close to Zora, at how their hands automatically found each other's. I see that now, Henry said quietly. Can you ever forgive me? Zora hugged her father tightly. We'll work on it, Daddy. Together. Later, as they drove back to the manor in the setting sun, Nathaniel glanced at Zora. You were incredible today, he said softly. We both were, she replied. Then, after a pause, what happens now? Nathaniel pulled the car over and turned to face her. Now I do something I should have done weeks ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, their original contract about her family's debt. In one motion, he tore it in half. Nathaniel, no, Zora protested. The debt was based on James's illegal interest rates, he finished. The real debt was paid off months ago through your work. You're free, Zora, free to leave or free to stay. Your choice. Zora looked at the torn contract, then at Nathaniel. And if I stay? Then you stay, because you want to, he said softly. Because we want to see where this leads. No debt, no obligation, just us. Instead of answering, Zora leaned across the car and kissed him. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I'll take that as a yes," Nathaniel whispered. But even as they drove home together, happy at last, they didn't know that James Morgan had one final card to play. In his pocket was a USB drive with information that could destroy them both. Information about the real reason the Carter farm had been in debt all those years ago. James Morgan sat in his dark apartment, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle. His computer screen glowed with old files he'd kept hidden for years. Files about the Carter family farm, about Zora's mother, and about a secret that would tear everything apart. He picked up his phone and dialed Zora's number. At Sinclair Manor, Zora and Nathaniel were having dinner together for the first time as a real couple. No more pretending, no more holding back. Zora's phone buzzed and she almost ignored it until she saw the number. "James," she said coldly, putting the phone on speaker. "What do you want?" "Did you ever wonder why your mother left, Zora?" James's voice was slurred but cruel. "Did your father ever tell you the real story?" Zora's hand froze halfway to her wineglass. "My mother abandoned us, everyone knows that." "Wrong," James laughed. "She tried to save you all. She knew about the secret in the farm's original deed. She tried to tell everyone, but no one would. Listen." Nathaniel reached for Zora's hand across the table. "What are you talking about, James?" "Oh, the great Nathaniel Sinclair doesn't know?" James sounded delighted. "Check the old county records. Look up the Carter farm deed from 1985. You'll find something very interesting." The line went dead. Zora sat there, shaking. "He's lying," she whispered. "He has to be. My mother left us. She chose to go." But Nathaniel was already on his laptop accessing old county records. His face went pale as he read. "Zora," he said quietly, "I think you need to see this." The document on the screen was old, but the words were clear. The Carter farm hadn't just been a family farm. It had been part of a trust. A trust worth millions, set up by Zora's great-grandfather for all his descendants. But someone had changed the papers, hiding the trust's existence. "There's more," Nathaniel said, clicking through files. "Your mother, she hired a lawyer to investigate. She found evidence that someone had stolen the trust money, but before she could prove it, she disappeared," Zora finished, her voice hollow. "Everyone said she ran away with another man, but she was trying to protect us." Nathaniel kept reading, his face getting darker. The lawyer who helped hide the trust, it was James's father, and the bank that handled the missing money was owned by your father, Zora guessed. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Our fathers were business partners. They stole your family's money, Zora. Then they made it look like your father had gambled away the farm's value. That's where the original debt came from." Zora stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "All these years, my mother wasn't a villain. She was a hero. And my father, does he know?" "Call him," Nathaniel said gently. "He needs to hear this." Henry Carter arrived at the manor 30 minutes later, looking worried. When they showed him the documents, he collapsed into a chair. "Martha," he whispered, his wife's name. "She tried to tell me. She said something was wrong with the farm's papers, but I didn't believe her. I believed what Richard Sinclair and James's father told me, that she was just causing trouble." "Daddy," Zora knelt beside him, taking his hands. "This means the debt was never real. The farm should be worth millions." "I can make this right," Nathaniel said firmly. "I'll get the trust restored, with all the missing money returned. Everything my father stole, I'll pay back myself if I have to." Just then, Nathaniel's phone chimed with a text from James. "Check your email. The press gets these files in 1 hour unless you transfer $10 million to my account. Your father's crimes exposed, your reputation ruined. Clock's ticking." Nathaniel looked at Zora and Henry. "He's threatening to expose everything." "Good," Zora said, standing up. "Let him." "But my father's crimes, my family name, will survive," Zora said firmly, "because you're nothing like your father. You're trying to make things right." Henry cleared his throat. "Martha would want the truth to come out, all of it." Nathaniel looked at them both, then straightened his shoulders. He typed a quick response to James. Release the files, we'll beat you to it. Within minutes, Nathaniel was on the phone with his PR team, preparing a press release. The story would be huge, how the children of two wealthy men discovered their father's crimes and worked to make them right. Are you sure about this? Zora asked softly. It will change everything. Everything already changed the day you walked into my office, Nathaniel replied, pulling her close. You taught me that real strength isn't about power or money. It's about doing what's right. Henry watched them with tears in his eyes. Martha would have liked you, Nathaniel. She always said the truth would come out someday. As they worked, late into the night, preparing to face the storm that was coming, Zora felt a weight lift from her heart. Her mother hadn't abandoned them. She had tried to save them. And now, years later, her daughter would finish what she started. Somewhere across town, James Morgan stared at his phone in disbelief. They were going to expose everything willingly? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In a rage, he grabbed his keys. If they wanted to play it this way, fine. But he had one more card to play, the location where Martha Carter had last been seen, and the letters she had written to her children that James's father had hidden away. The truth about Martha Carter's disappearance was about to come out, and it would change everything once again. Dawn was breaking over Sinclair Manor when James Morgan's email arrived. Inside was a video file and a message. Meet me at the old Morgan family cabin in 2 hours, alone, or you'll never know what really happened to Martha Carter. Zora watched the video with shaking hands. It showed her mother, 15 years younger, walking into the Morgan family's hunting cabin. She never came out. I'm going, Zora said, grabbing her car keys. Not alone. Nathaniel stepped in front of her. James is desperate. He's dangerous. He's right, Henry Carter said. He had aged 10 years overnight after learning the truth about his wife. We go together. The drive to the cabin took almost 2 hours. It was deep in the woods, far from any other buildings. James's car was already parked outside. Stay behind. Me, Nathaniel said as they approached the cabin. Inside, James sat at an old wooden table. A gun lay next to his right hand, and a stack of old letters sat in front of him. I wondered if you'd come, he said, his voice rough. Daddy always said the Carters were predictable. Care about family more than money. That was their weakness. Where's my wife? Henry demanded. What did you do to Martha? James picked up the letters. She wrote these to her children, one for each birthday she knew she'd miss. My father kept them all these years. Want to know why? Zora took a step forward. Because she found proof that your father and Richard Sinclair stole our family's money. Smart girl. James smiled coldly. Yes, she found the proof. Came here to confront my father with it, but she didn't know my father had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking. You killed her, Henry whispered in horror. Not me, James shook his head. I was just a kid, but I saw it happen. Saw her fall after my father hit her. Saw her head hit the corner of this table, and then... You're lying, Zora said, but her voice shook. James stood up slowly. Check under the floorboards in the back room. That's where my father put her. Said nobody would ever look there. Rich men can make anything disappear. Nathaniel had been quiet, studying James carefully. Now he spoke. But that's not all, is it? Your father didn't just kill Martha. The guilt drove him to suicide a year later. Very good, Sinclair, James laughed bitterly. Dear old Dad couldn't live with what he'd done. But he made sure I knew everything first. Made sure I knew it was the Carters' fault. If Martha hadn't threatened to expose everything... James reached for the gun, but Nathaniel was faster. In one motion, he knocked the weapon away and pinned James against the wall. Henry, call the police, Nathaniel ordered. Zora, stay here. But Zora was already walking toward the back room. Her legs felt like lead as she knelt down and touched the old floorboards. One of them was loose. Mama, she whispered, tears falling. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They found Martha Carter's remains exactly where James had said they would be. They found the letters too. 15 years of birthday wishes and love from a mother to her. Children never delivered. As James was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Nathaniel. You think this makes you better than our fathers. You're still a Sinclair, still got their blood. No, Nathaniel said quietly. I'm the man who loves Zora Carter. That's all that matters. They stayed at the cabin until everything was done. The police investigation, the crime scene photos, the removal of Martha's remains. Henry sat in his truck reading his wife's last letters and crying quietly. Zora stood at the edge of the woods, looking out at nothing. Nathaniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. "She loved you so much," he said softly. "These letters, she wrote about everything she hoped for you. College, career, love. She wanted you to be strong and independent. She died. Trying to protect us," Zora whispered. "All these years we thought she abandoned us, but she was fighting for us until the end. Just like her daughter," Nathaniel said, turning her to face him. "You never stopped fighting either." Zora buried her face in his chest and finally let herself break down. All the years of thinking her mother didn't want them, all the shame of being the abandoned family, all the struggles to keep the farm, it had all been built on lies. Later that night, back at Sinclair Manor, Nathaniel made an announcement to the press. He revealed everything: his father's crimes, the stolen trust money, Martha Carter's murder. He promised to restore the Carter family's fortune and help bring justice for Martha. "My father was wrong," he told the reporters. "Real strength isn't about power over others. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Martha Carter knew that, and her daughter taught me the same lesson." The story made headlines everywhere. Millionaire exposes family crimes to protect woman he loves. Carter family mystery solved after 15 years. Justice for Martha Carter. But in the quiet of Sinclair Manor, none of that mattered. Zora sat in the garden reading her mother's letters one by one. Nathaniel brought her tea and sat silently beside her, offering his strength. "She would have liked you," Zora said finally, looking up from a letter. "She wrote about hoping I'd find someone who saw me for who I really am." "I see you," Nathaniel said softly, "and I love everything I see." As the sun set, they held each other, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges. The trust had to be restored, the farm rebuilt, Martha's funeral planned. But they would face it all together. What they didn't know was that Martha Carter had left one final letter, one that even James hadn't known about. It was buried in the farm's old barn, waiting to be found, and its contents would change everything one last time. The old Carter farm barn stood weathered but proud against the morning sky. Zora walked through it slowly, touching the worn wood beams. This was where she'd played as a child, where her mother had told her stories about their family's history. "She used to spend a lot of time in here," Henry said, following his daughter into the barn. "Said she was organizing old papers, but now I wonder..." Nathaniel watched from the doorway as father and daughter searched through years of dust and memories. The past week had been a whirlwind of police investigations, press conferences, and tears. Martha's funeral was planned for tomorrow. "Look at this," Zora called out suddenly. She was running her hands along one of the support beams. "There's something carved here, numbers." Nathaniel came closer. Carved into the wood were 4 numbers, 1, 9, 8 to 5, the year the trust was stolen, Henry whispered. Together, they looked around the barn with new eyes. The numbers had to mean something. Zora noticed that one of the floorboards under the beam looked different from the others. "Help me with this," she said, kneeling down. It took all 3 of them to pry up the old board. Inside, the space beneath, was a metal box sealed against time and weather. With trembling hands, Zora opened it. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to "My dearest family" in Martha's handwriting. But there was something else too, a small leather notebook and a set of old photographs. "Read it," Henry said softly, his voice breaking. Zora opened the letter and began to read aloud. "My darling family, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally come out. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you better. But there's something else you need to know, something that could change everything. Richard Sinclair isn't just the man who helped steal our family's trust. He's also my half-brother." Zora stopped reading, her hands shaking. Nathaniel sat down hard on a hay bale. "Keep reading," Henry urged. "My mother had a relationship with Richard's father before she married my father. She never told anyone except me on her deathbed. Richard and I found out we were siblings just months before the trust was stolen. I thought knowing the truth would make him help us. Instead, it made him desperate to hide our connection. The notebook in this box contains all the proof, letters between our parents, birth records, everything. Richard was so afraid of the scandal, of losing his place in society, that he helped steal our family's money just to keep me quiet. But blood isn't what makes a family. Love does. And I loved you all so much that I had to fight for justice, even knowing the risk. To my children, never let anyone make you feel small. You come from a line of strong, proud people who worked this land with love. To my dear Henry, forgive me for not telling you everything. I thought I was protecting you, and if somehow someday this letter finds its way to Richard's son, know that you're not responsible for your father's sins. We all choose our own path. All my love. Martha. The barn was silent except for Henry's quiet sobs. Nathaniel stared at the floor, his world turned upside down. We're cousins, Zora whispered, looking at Nathaniel. Half-cousins, he said quietly. Does this change how you feel? Zora stood up and walked to him. No, she said firmly. Like Mama wrote, blood isn't what makes a family. Love is. She took his face in her hands and kissed him softly. When they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. But the press, Nathaniel started. Don't get it, Henry spoke up suddenly. The old papers show Martha's mother was married to her father when she was born. Legally, there's no connection between our families. Your father's fear was all for nothing. Zora opened the notebook, confirming what her father said. Legally, Martha's mother had been married to Henry's father when Martha was born. Under the law of the time, that made him her legal father, regardless of biology. So we can be together, Zora said softly. Without scandal, without shame. We were always going to be together, Nathaniel replied, pulling her close. No matter. What? As the sun set over the farm, they sat in the barn reading through Martha's notebook. She had documented everything, not just the trust, theft, but her own journey to understand her complicated family history. She was so brave, Zora said, touching her mother's handwriting. She faced impossible choices, but she never stopped fighting for what was right. Just like her daughter, Nathaniel smiled, but there was one more surprise waiting in the box. At the very bottom, wrapped in silk, was a small velvet pouch. Inside was an old engagement ring, a simple gold band with a single pearl. My grandmother's ring, Henry said, in wonder. Martha wore it until that last day. She must have left it here for safekeeping. He handed the ring to Zora. It belongs to you now, baby girl, a reminder of where you come from and who you are. Zora slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling connected to her mother in a way she never had before. Nathaniel watched her with love in his eyes, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they walked back to the house, the old barn stood silent, behind them, having given up its last secret. But in the growing darkness, something stirred in the shadows. James Morgan, out on bail, watched them go. In his hand was a copy of Martha's letter, one he'd made years ago when his father first found the box. Blood isn't what makes a family, he whispered mockingly, but it sure can destroy one. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Hello, National Enquirer. I have a story you might be interested in. The morning headlines screamed across every newspaper and gossip site. Sinclair Carter scandal. Secret family ties revealed. James Morgan had done his worst, leaking Martha's letter to the press. Zora stood in Nathaniel's office at Sinclair Manor, watching the media circus gathering outside the gates. What do we do now? Nathaniel turned away from the window and took her hands in his. We do what your mother would have done. We face it head-on with truth and dignity. Just then, Henry Carter burst into the office waving a piece of paper. Look what I found in Martha's notebook. We all missed it yesterday. It was a small note, tucked into the very back page. To whoever tries to use this truth as a weapon, check the dates carefully. Check the law. Love finds a way. Nathaniel grabbed his phone and called his lawyer. 10 minutes later, they had their answer. Martha was brilliant, Nathaniel said, smiling for the first time that day. The dates in her mother's marriage certificate, compared to her birth certificate. Legally, there's no way Richard Sinclair could have been her half-brother. The timing makes it impossible. Which means, Zora started. Which means James leaked a lie, Nathaniel finished, and I'm going to prove it. He called a press conference right there on the front steps of Sinclair Manor. With Zora by his side, he addressed the crowd of reporters. Yes, my father and Martha Carter were connected by their shared involvement in the trust theft, but the rumors about them being siblings are mathematically and legally impossible. Here are the documents to prove it. As the reporters scrambled to verify the dates, James Morgan watched from his car down the street. His final attempt at revenge had failed, but he had one last card to play. He stepped out of his car, a gun visible in his waistband, but before he could take 3 steps, police cars surrounded him. James Morgan, the chief of police, called out, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and criminal harassment." What James didn't know was that his phone calls to the National Enquirer had been recorded. The police had been waiting for him to make one final mistake. As James was led away in handcuffs for the last time, he saw Nathaniel and Zora standing together on the steps. They looked unbreakable. Back inside the manor, Nathaniel turned to Zora. "I think it's time we wrote our own story. No more secrets, no more scandals, just us." He got down on one knee, pulling out a small box. Inside was Zora's grandmother's pearl ring, now mounted in a new setting alongside a diamond. "Martha's strength lives on in you," he said softly. "And I want to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that strength. Zora Carter, will you marry me?" Tears rolled down Zora's face as she nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. 1 year later, the Carter family farm had been transformed. The old barn was now an art gallery showcasing local artists. The fields were still worked, but now they also hosted community events and farmers' markets. In front of the restored farmhouse, chairs were set up for a wedding. Flowers and ribbons decorated every surface, and a photo of Martha Carter sat in a place of honor. Henry Carter walked his daughter down the aisle, both of them stopping to touch Martha's photo as they passed. Nathaniel waited under an arch of sunflowers, Zora's favorite. When he saw her in her simple white dress, wearing her mother's pearl ring, he couldn't hold back his tears. "We are gathered here today," the minister began, "not just to unite 2 people, but to celebrate the triumph of love over adversity, truth over lies, and hope over fear." During the vows, Zora spoke about how Nathaniel had changed from a cold businessman into a man who put love and justice first. Nathaniel spoke about how Zora had taught him the true meaning of strength and dignity. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, a warm breeze swept through the farm, carrying the scent of sunflowers. Some would later say they felt Martha's presence blessing the union. At the reception, Henry Carter stood to make a toast. Martha used to say that love finds a way. She never gave up fighting for what was right, and her spirit lives on in our daughter. To Zora and Nathaniel, may your love always light the way. Later, as the sun set over the farm, Nathaniel and Zora danced under the stars. The Carter family farm, once nearly lost to greed and lies, now stood as a symbol of love's victory over adversity. "Your mother would be proud," Nathaniel whispered to his bride. "She is," Zora replied, touching her pearl ring. "She's here in every sunflower, every breath of wind, every moment of love." As they danced, the warm evening air carried the scent of flowers and promise. On Martha's grave, freshly planted with sunflowers, the petals stirred in the breeze. Love had found its way just as she always said it would. In his prison cell, James Morgan received a wedding announcement. Inside was a note that read, "We forgive you. Love is stronger than hate." He crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out again. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. The next morning's headlines told a different kind of story. Love triumphs. Carter-Sinclair wedding celebrates family healing. And so the story that began with a debt and a desperate deal ended with love and redemption. Nathaniel and Zora Sinclair went on to transform his business empire into a force for good, helping other families keep their homes and farms. The old barn still stands on the Carter farm, its weathered walls now holding art instead of secrets. And if you visit on a quiet evening, when the sunflowers dance in the breeze, some say you can feel Martha Carter's spirit, watching over her family with pride and love. Because in the end, love didn't just find a way, it found the best way of all.